Romney's second choice in Iowa is unquestionably Ron Paul, because Ron Paul is an unthinkable Republican nominee. He's the ideal Democratic version of the Republican nominee. And if he emerges as the major alternative, then I think Romney's pretty close to sealing the deal.
Steve, what's the implication of a Ron Paul victory in Iowa? What does it say about New Hampshire, South Carolina, Florida, and so forth?
Well, I think what's more important is the durability of Ron Paul in this race. If he wins Iowa, is he able to go forward during the entirety of the Republican nominating process, picking up 15 to 20% of the vote? If that happens all the way through the process, he would stand at the end of it, the leader of a sizable faction in the Republican Party that supports views that are antithetical to the views of much of the mainstream of the Republican Party. So you see this interesting debate starting to take place in the Republican Party, precipitated by the rise of Ron Paul and his movement, which is, I think, a lot more serious than it was 4 years ago.
We've all had this conversation on many occasions. It just seems like this process on the GOP side of the aisle is lacking practicality. As badly as they want to defeat Barack Obama, there doesn't seem to be an analysis by many of these voters as to who among those on the stage is best suited to win a general and not a primary.
Well, there's always.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Steve. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I was going to say, I think an increasing question for the Republican nominee ultimately is, how do you keep Ron Paul in the fold? How do you keep Ron Paul and his movement inside the Republican Party, prevent him from leaving the party to mount a third-party bid? Because if your goal is as a Republican to win the White House, a third-party Ron Paul bid is a big problem as you look ahead to November.
Hey, Bob, let me see what you think of this. Paul, who's leading in some of these Iowa polls, as we've mentioned, now seeing what it's like to be a front runner. The Weekly Standard reports on the inflammatory quotes from some of those newsletters that were published under his name 20 years ago. One newsletter featured a quote about the LA riots, which read, quote, "Order was only restored in LA when it came time for the blacks to pick up their welfare checks." Another newsletter said people with AIDS should not be allowed to eat in restaurants because, quote, "AIDS can be transmitted by saliva." There was also a quote referring to Israel as an aggressive nationalist socialist state, and criticism of Ronald Reagan for making Martin Luther King Day a federal holiday, referring to it as the annual Hate Whitey Day. Ron Paul says he's not the one who signed these, wrote these. He's not sure who did. Bob Shrum, what's the impact?
Well, I don't know whether he wrote them or not, but the truth of the matter is that he published them. I think they're disqualifying. I think Steve's absolutely right. He's not only unacceptable inside the Republican Party, outside the mainstream of the Republican Party, he's unacceptable in America. He's a disqualified presidential candidate, and not just because of what he's written, but he could win Iowa. Look, as Steve knows very well, because he and I spent a lot of Decembers and Januaries in Iowa, Iowa operates a little differently on the Republican side than the Democratic side. Since 1980, in contested Iowa caucuses, the Democratic winner has gone on to the nomination 84% of the time. For Republicans, that figure is only 60%. Pat Robertson, for heaven's sake, finished ahead of George H.W. Bush in 1988. That didn't mean that Republicans didn't come back in 1996 and contest the caucuses. They did. But I can tell you right now, there's a real chance, I think, that Iowa could take a flyer here, unless those Gingrich bleeds all go to Romney and Romney pulls an upset. And then Romney has an ideal situation either way. Either he wins Iowa, he's on a roll, or he gets to run against Ron Paul, and I can't conceive that he wouldn't be the Republican nominee under those circumstances.
Steve, is it a pipe dream that some semblance of a GOP organization or establishment in Iowa can get it together and say, hey, we don't want to be embarrassed here. We got to pick a winner, and consequently, in the next 2 weeks, we need to coalesce around candidate X or Y?
I don't know if there's any establishment that has that level of control over this part of the Republican primary electorate. I think one of the things we've seen already this year is the diminution of importance of the Iowa straw poll, and I suspect in 4 years you'll have even fewer candidates participating in it than this year. But if the caucus does, finish, the person who finishes in the caucus, in the first position is someone who is not electable, is considered a fringe candidate by a majority of the party. That doesn't bode well for the future of the Iowa caucuses. And I think that's certainly a fair point.
Bob, if I'm in the White House and I'm watching what's going on the Republican side of the aisle, given the fluid nature of it, I imagine I'm thrilled.
Yeah, you're thrilled, but in the end of the day, I think the Obama campaign believes it's going to be Romney. And, you know, the funny thing is, we've searched all year for the un-Romney. The truth is, Romney may win because he's the un-Gingrich, the un-Paul, the un-Perry, and the un-Bachmann. He may be a flip-flopper, but he doesn't seem fatally flawed to Republicans.
Thank you both, Steve Schmidt and